Crud. I totally forgot to change some of the settings. There's some people come in here thinking it's Xenoblade Chronicles. Whoops. I totally forgot to change the content setting. Oh well. I mean, it'd be great if you guys came and stuck around for the Book of Romans. But before that, we're just gonna do some social media stuff. You know how it be. Okay. Whew. I'm gonna turn the fan on because it's kind of hot. If the fan ends up being too noisy, just let me know. I'm gonna really turn it off, move it further away. I don't need it this close. Okay. Hello and welcome to a new reading series. As today we're doing the Book of Romans. Or I guess I should do this more proper, right? So hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Romans. Yes, we are doing a new reading series starting today. And for the Book of Romans, we're going to do something very different that I did not do and I didn't think of doing for any of the other books that I've read on stream. But that's, of course, because with the narratives, all the other books that I read on the channel were all narrative types. So Genesis, Exodus, Samuel, etc. They're all narratives. And so narratives, you could, like in your typical sermon, like a pastor will only take like even just a few verses at a time, even sometimes for a sermon. But I feel like for these kind of reading streams, you don't want to just do like one chapter for those. But the Book of Romans is very different. I feel like I only want to do one chapter at a time. One, I could keep the streams a little bit shorter, maybe, depending on like if you guys don't cram me with Q&As and stuff like that. And of course, the other thing too is that with the nature of the Book of Romans, not that there isn't a lot of like deep theology and like a narrative story in the Bible. That's not like that isn't true. But at the same time, I feel like taking the Book of Romans one chapter at a time, you can dig into deeper theology that's kind of played out in the book of Romans, and I will explain a little bit of like the context of Romans in today's video, because we're doing chapter 1, as well as basically I'm going to do like an introductory course, if you will, a crash course introduction of the book of Romans, which is actually how we're going to start. But before that, if you want to follow along, I'll be using the New International Version, or NIV. Although I won't be reading for like a while. Yeah, I'm going to actually do the crash course at the beginning. But I encourage you guys to follow along anyway. So, just have a Bible next to you, or, just use your computer. Bible's free on the internet, so why not do that? So, yeah. I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll just dive right into it. Because I know we're already starting pretty late as it is. I had to run an errand, so, and I just got back like a few minutes ago, before starting the stream anyway, so. Anyway, let's just bow our heads, and then we'll begin. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day, and I thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read through the book of Romans, I just pray that you would continue to empower us on how to be faithful to you in this generation and in this age. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so, the book of Romans. And there's a lot to talk about the book of Romans. The book of Romans is, I think, a very, very interesting book in the Bible. Especially from an academic perspective. I think Romans is really kind of unique in a lot of ways. The first thing that makes Romans really stand out, especially if you compare it to the other Pauline letters, which I'll explain what that is in a bit, is that the book of Romans is the only Pauline letter that it's where Paul takes the initiative. Now, you're probably wondering what the hell that means. So basically, the Pauline letters are a series of books or letters in the Bible that are attributed to St. Paul, that he's technically the one who wrote them. There have been some debates among scholars about like which ones he actually wrote, and I use that in quotes as well. And these books go from the book of Romans all the way to, I think it's 2nd Thessalonians, or what we call, because after Thessalonians is Timothy, but Timothy's a different kind of letter, even though that one is also attributed to Paul. But it's not the same as like a Pauline letter. The Pauline letters are, well, one, they're attributed to Paul. And the same Paul that would be, the great apostle in the book of Acts, which, if I have to answer the question of who's Paul at this point, I mean, go watch the book of Acts videos, okay? I know I've been slacking, and I haven't made that playlist of the book of Acts yet, but go watch the book of Acts videos when I finally get that playlist up, okay? I shouldn't have to answer the question of who is St. Paul at this point. But basically, Paul has like two sets of letters. He's got the Pauline epistles, as we tend to call them. That's from like the book of Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Thessalonians. Am I missing any of them? I don't know. I might be missing them. I might be missing one or two of them. But you get the point. And then after that, in the Bible canon, you get what we call the pastoral epistles, which are a little bit different. And the main difference is that, for the most part, Philemon is a very strange case, because like the letter is addressed to Philemon, but at the same time it's also like a church letter. But it is more of a personal letter. So the book of Timothy and Titus and Philemon are more personal letters, whereas the Pauline epistles are Paul writing to a particular church. And so these books are letters to churches. But what makes the book of Romans stand out among them, and most people theorize that it is in fact the oldest of the other Pauline epistles, although there are some contentions between like maybe the book of Ephesians could have been written earlier. We know the book of Corinthians was probably written later. 2 Corinthians for sure. But what makes the book of Romans really stand out is that the book of Romans was the only of the Pauline epistles not to get them confused with the pastoral epistles before someone goes like, well, in the pastoral epistles like this too. But with the Pauline epistles, so once again, Corinthians, Thessalonians, etc., the book of Romans is the only one that is not a response letter. Now, that's the thing that the average Christian should know this. But I know there are some people who like they'll read through some of the letters and they'll be like, oh, why is Corinthians written the way that it's written, and has it like its bizarre ass statements, which sound really weird without context. But that's because the nature of Corinthians is that it's all about context. And unfortunately, and one of the things that many people have problems with when you read the other Pauline epistles is that Paul will make statements that the context for it is lost. And so you can't be 100% sure on how that passage should be read, let alone applied. Because the book of, say, Corinthians, for example, and Galatians, they all have a particular context that is missing for us modern readers, because of course those letters were all response letters. Paul was responding to something these churches already wrote to him, and then Paul is just responding to it. So basically all the other books are basically like response emails, but the book of Romans is very different in that Romans, Paul takes the initiative and he writes to them first. This is, you'll kind of see this as we go along the book of Romans. And how Paul goes through a lot of basics of like Christianity in the book of Romans, which you would not find in like Corinthians. Corinthians for sure. And that's why Corinthians is such a hard book to read. Sorry. Maybe I should not be chewing on coconut jelly while I'm talking. But like the book of Corinthians, one of the big issues of reading the book of Corinthians is that because so much context is missing, and the nature of Paul's relationship to the Corinthians is very different, then the text seems quote unquote more advanced. And it's not something that, like, you know, you couldn't just pick up the book of Corinthians and start reading, trying to figure out what it means and all that stuff. Like, the book of Corinthians is very nuanced like that. But what makes the book of Romans great, especially for a Bible study, like, you know, the one I'm doing literally right now, is that the book of Romans doesn't have this needed context. There's a little bit of context here and there, but it's very basic things that, one, the book of Acts doesn't already cover, which I will make some reference to it. Like, and now I'm going to make retro references, if you will, because when I was doing the Book of Acts reading, I did some kind of epi-reference of stuff in the Book of Acts that would later be useful to know in the Book of Romans, and then I will now kind of retro reference those things that I mentioned in the Book of Acts. And so like, there's a little bit of that in the Book of Romans, but it's very minimal. And so it's not, like, you hardly notice it, let alone, like, think it's relevant. Like, I'll still mention it, and then you'll kind of, like, think, well, who cares? Because that doesn't really matter. And it doesn't in the grand scheme of reading the Book of Romans. Although I will use those Book of Acts moments as, like, a bit of interesting trivia. But, anyway. That's kind of the whole thing about the Book of Romans and the Pauline epistles. Just a little quick 10-minute introduction to it. Another thing, too, that we need to keep in mind as we read through the book of Romans is that there's a very different relational aspect. I kind of referenced this just a couple minutes ago when I was talking about how when you read some of the other Pauline epistles like Corinthians and Galatians, Paul has an established relationship with those churches. For example, in the book of Ephesians, for sure, and Galatians, Paul was there when these churches were founded. He essentially founded these churches. And so he has a close connection to them, being essentially a founding member of two churches at least. But the book of Romans is not like that at all. Paul is the more distant person. And I make this kind of joke reference thing, where like I kind of view Paul as more as the first pope than Peter was, even though in Catholic tradition, Peter is recognized as the first pope, and that's based on the whole like Jesus giving Peter the keys to heaven and all that stuff, and of course Peter being the spokesman of the apostles on the day of Pentecost, etc., etc. But in a way, Paul acts very much like the first pope in that he kind of acts as a central hierarchical figure that other churches kind of network through. And then, of course, part of that would be him distributing doctrinal documents to the other churches, which is another function of these letters as you read through the Pauline epistles. You kind of see like the patterns if you read through like the different letters, and those are part of like this whole doctrinal center, a doctrinal consistency, if you will, of what makes Christianity Christianity, if that makes sense. And so Paul does a lot more of this. You don't see Peter do this very much, and especially not in the Bible at the very least. I mean, there's a little bit of him doing that in, history, and this, he's still recognized as the first pope, and so a lot of people would still go to like, well, and part of it is because of like the whole Jerusalem thing, which Acts 15, and Paul being the main leader in the Church of Jerusalem, so that there's the whole Jerusalem and Vatican parallel. But Paul, at least in these, as we see from these letters, he's the one that's more often, distributing Christian doctrine to other churches. Of course, there's an interesting thing to note with how what makes Christianity essentially interesting for like, I made the joke that it started out as a Jewish cult, but at the same time, Christianity does like all the opposite things of like your traditional cults would do. And one of those things was when Christianity was building churches in other places, they didn't act like in that weird, creepy cult way where like they really controlled their members. In a way, their members were still mostly free agents. But of course, there was a high risk when you do that, when you give, your new churches all these free agents. And that danger was the potential of misrepresenting the gospel and creating like false doctrines, which if you read through, especially in the Pauline epistles, and then you read in the book of Revelation for sure, apparently they're like false doctrines became pretty rampant. So there's that whole like, you might want to say like a big L in the world of Christianity, that like, oops, like you got all these twisted doctrines running around, and unfortunately that's something that still happens to this very day, and Christianity constantly has headbutts with dealing with false doctrines even within the church. And the irony though behind it is that many people will use that as an argument to say like, well, Christianity, see, this is why Christianity doesn't work, because false doctrines can arise in it pretty quickly. You compare it to like say Islam, and Islam doesn't deal with like as many false doctrines, problems as Christianity does. But then when you actually look at the way people are operating within like Christianity versus Islam, for example, you kind of see that like Christianity has something that's way better. But once again, there's a particular danger to it, and that danger is when you have free agents kind of doing whatever, you leave room for a lot of possibility of misrepresenting the gospel at times, and there's a risk of that. I mean, I even acknowledge that in my own videos here, and I make it no secret that like, okay, like I'm not perfect. I can misrepresent things. I can misrepresent the gospel at times, and you can get the wrong ideas when I use like the strangest parallels when I compare the gospel to something else, and stuff like that happens on the channel. But that is because in Christianity and the development of doctrine, in the Christian world, we allow for free agents. Pastors behave like free agents. Christian believers are free agents in their expression of faith. Whereas in a lot of other religions, that doesn't actually exist. And then, of course, that's where you run into the big problem of, if you talk about like, oh, I'm still gonna get like shot for this one over the internet, but using Islam as the best example of this, all the quote unquote the conflict between like extremist Muslims and moderate Muslims, and then all the moderate Muslims try to claim that like, well, Islam is not about like these violent moments and these violent doctrines, but then all the extremists all yell, no, you're all just a bunch of idiotic heretics that don't take the Quran literally, and that crazy argument between your extremists and your moderates. But in Christianity, the idea is that Christians were free agents, and so people were allowed to. And this is where on the larger scale, this is where throughout history, as Christianity entered different cultures also injected elements of their culture into Christianity. The whole joke of like white Jesus, black Jesus, Chinese Jesus, is because every culture, as Christianity was introduced to different cultures, every culture also injected their own culture into Christianity. And for better or for worse, because some things stuck and some things didn't stick, and some things were compatible and some things were not. And you just kind of have to deal with that. But what made Christianity interesting was that Christianity operated in this and the key word here is that it's a very free kind of religion, if that makes sense. It's a free religion in the sense that Christianity did allow for cultural flexibility. I mean, to be fair, that was how Christianity in the first century was going to expand. It wasn't just going to stick around in, Judea, but it had to go, as Jesus commanded his disciples, to go to the ends of the earth. And so Christianity, in order to do this, if you will, was to allow that kind of cultural flexibility. However, the downside to this is that it does give room for heresies to arrive, for people to interject things that may not be compatible with Christianity, etc., etc. And so, with that said, and as Christianity expanded in the first century, the church, and especially St. Paul here, figured that like, well, shit, we actually better have like a central doctrinal idea of what it means to be Christian as we keep expanding. Because if we keep planting these churches and then we don't leave them with that Christian authority, as later we'll call it the apostolic tradition, if we don't leave them with this, well then who knows what's going to happen to Christianity in a few decades, if even that long. And so this probably incentivized Paul, and probably others, but we only have Paul's recording here with the book of Romans, but this probably incentivized a lot of the apostles to probably create these doctrinal documents and then send them to Christians in other parts of the world, especially as the church was expanding. And so the book of Romans, I know I went on a crazy ass tirade to come to this point, that what makes the book of Romans pretty interesting is that it does utilize a lot of like the Christianity 101 notes. And so, if you're a long-time Christian, you're going to read some of the book of Romans and you're going to be like, you're not telling me anything new. At least I hope you think that, because I'm not telling you anything new. The book of Romans, its main purpose was to kind of bring this to the basics and a kind of making a definitive Christianity, if that makes sense. Think of like, your definitive editions as a remaster old video games. You get the definitive edition. Well, that's what the book of Romans basically is when it comes to early Christian doctrine. That is the book of Romans' purpose. But we won't really cover a lot of that today, so you won't see it right away. After all, chapter 1 is just an introduction. And then there's like a little bit of ego stroking that Paul does, which is, I think, brilliant. But anyway, that's basically my introduction to the book of Romans. And there's more to talk about, obviously, but we'll cover that as we progress through the book of Romans, which will take us 16 weeks, assuming I get a chapter done every week. Which, yes, will take us through the Christmas season. But let's be real, I've already done Nativity Bible streams twice already, because this channel is that old. I've been around for almost 2 years now. We are not doing a Nativity reading this year. I'm going to tell you that right now. All right, you can find other Bible streamers to do that. We're doing the book of Romans till the end of the year. You just got to deal with it. And this is assuming I do a reading every single week. Okay. Coconut jelly was a bad idea. Maybe I should have gotten grass jelly or something. But anyway. Alright, here we go. We're going to start reading, or we're going to read, Romans chapter 1. St. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, regarding his Son, who as to his earthly life was a descendant of David, and who through the Spirit of holiness was appointed the Son of God in power. By his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, through him we received grace and apostleship to call all Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. And you also are among those Gentiles who are called to belong to Christ Jesus. Now to all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be his holy people, grace and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. Now first I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God whom I serve in my spirit is preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times, and I pray that now at last by God's will the way may be opened for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by one another's faith. I don't want you to become unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but I have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among other Gentiles. Now I am obligated, both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and to the fool. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel, also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because of its power, and the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people, who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been seen clearly, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like human mortals, made to look like human mortals, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Now because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, and no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do those very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Starting off strong, I see. So, yeah. Let's go through chapter 1. So, at the beginning of the letter, so that's verse 1 to verse 7, basically. It's just an introduction. Paul is saying, hey guys, what's up? Not much else to say about this part of the passage, really. I mean, when you write long letters, especially like, it's one of those things that like, in our modern day and age, where we can have instant messaging anywhere in the world that takes seconds, and we have a lot of space to do it with, because the ether cloud can be as big as we need it to be. You don't have to worry about being concise with your message. You're allowed to have do-overs and stuff like that. Whereas like, you're thinking like in the ancient world context. If you actually had to write this stuff down, paper ain't cheap. Sending paper ain't cheap. Ink ain't cheap. Sending ink ain't cheap. And so when someone was writing a letter and Paul would actually like, sauce up, if you will, the letter and the introduction. And this kind of continues a little bit into the next part, but we'll kind of expand on that further. Where, as Paul introduces himself to the church in Rome, you gotta, as your mom probably told you, you don't get a second chance to make a good first impression. And so this whole, like, interesting wording of, like, thank God that I get to write to you and all that stuff is all because of how difficult it would be to normally send messages and letters to people. Whereas, like, today we wouldn't quite grasp that idea because it's so easy to just send messages over the internet. Thank God for the internet and how easy it is. All right, so let's talk about Paul's desire to enter Rome. And this is where a lot of the scholars get the idea that this is an older document. Because most of the other Pauline epistles were probably written when Paul was a prisoner in Rome. I mean, to be fair, he had to do something while he was there. So, and that's where, Paul would write his letters, It was easy to send them to Paul because he was stuck in one place mostly when he was in Rome. But as we read in this letter likely takes place during the 2 years that he was stuck with, it was Festus or Felix? I think it was Felix. Who was first? Let me just I better fact check that one. Felix. So after Paul was accused of blasphemy and stuff like that, and was sent to Caesarea, he was under one of the governors there, and the governor at the time was a dude named Felix. And Felix was kind of a money grubbing greedy person for, using nicer words. But basically, Felix was a bit of a money grubber, so he kept Paul in prison hoping for some bribes, and then it never happened. So Felix just left Paul in prison in Caesarea for basically 2 years, which we assume was the rest of Felix's term. Then, of course, you go to the next chapter, and then we're introduced to Festus, who was the next kind of governor, and he was the one that was like, well, why do I even have this guy here? And then Paul eventually makes his appeal to Caesar, which would mean that he would have to go to Rome. And so this letter probably is written just before that all went down. And so Paul's kind of like, and this also was where I kind of mentioned in that video about how Paul clearly, like, he took those 2 years stuck with Felix to really plan to go to Rome. He would, and it's kind of funny because he would write to the Romans and then he would say, well, I plan to see you. And then he makes this interesting note in, what verse is it? I think it's verse 13. Yeah, in verse 13 where he's like, I wanted to see you in Rome, but I've been prevented to do so until now. And so, Paul maybe might be being a little cheap, being like, I plotted this whole thing. I know I shouldn't make it sound nefarious, but you can't say that, like, it was totally random either. Like, Paul clearly planned it. Although I shouldn't make it sound like he was nefarious about it, even though it's kind of fun to do so. But clearly, like, Paul was planning it, and this letter kind of gives that hint. At least when I read through the book of Acts and Paul has this whole appeal to Caesar, that there was a fair amount of planning. And the book of Romans, this part in Romans, chapter 1, kind of helps that idea and adds extra evidence that Paul wanted to, like, he was coming up with a plot of how to ensure he got to Rome. And so, like, Paul continuously saying that, like, yes, I really wanted to see you. I really want to see you. And what makes it interesting is that since Paul had never been to Rome yet, and this is where, once again, compared to the other Pauline epistles, Paul he already knows the people, for the most part, of the other churches. He knows them. But the Romans are basically strangers to him, which also changes a bit of the format of the writing, because, when you read the other letters, and Paul sometimes, like, gets them, he, like, grills into them a little bit, because he knows them, he feels he can get away with that. You don't really see that in the book of Romans. He never grills into these guys. But to be fair, if they're people you've never met before, you probably don't want to start. You don't want to start off on the wrong foot. And so there's a little bit of that, and this just cements the idea that this is before Paul goes to Rome. Which, once again, the later letters, most scholars agree that the later letters were written after Paul got to Rome, whereas the book of Romans, it's pretty well implied that this was written. Some scholars would say even more than, like, several years, as opposed to, like, that 2-year gap, as I mentioned in the book of Acts. Some scholars say that Paul wrote the book of Romans even before that. After all, in our modern translations, the little bit about Paul saying, well, I wanted to see you and didn't have the opportunity until now, some people actually say that that was an added piece of text, and that there was no indication that Paul would said anything clever like that, and wasn't trying to be, like, nefarious or anything like that. And so some scholars theorize that Paul wrote this way earlier. And that could also explain some of, like, Paul's to the basics, if you will, of Christianity when he was writing the book of Romans. There's a little funny bit of trivia and noting, though, once again, this is me just kind of poking fun at the Bible a little bit. But you gotta love how, in the introduction bit, especially when you start, like, you go from verse 7 to verse, let's say, like verse 10. Paul does some major ego stroking with these guys. I mean, to be fair, once again, your mom probably told you, you don't get a second chance at first impressions. Like, Paul wants to really, like, please like me. And so he, like, massively ego strokes these guys a little bit. He's just like, I thank God through Jesus Christ for all of you because your faith is being reported all over the world. Probably not true. Well, okay, I shouldn't say it that way. It's not like Paul is being deceitful or is not, especially not to even us, the audience. But at the same time, I think Paul is exaggerating a little bit. It's like, it's obviously hyperbole. The idea is like to make the Romans feel good. Not like, yeah, we're doing Christianity right over here, even though we haven't had any apostles come here. Which, I mean, to be fair, you know, Paul is right in the sense of like, yes, you should, to praise the Romans for how well they've been keeping the faith, because once again, when you get to the other churches in the Pauline epistles, well, Paul being an apostle, then these other churches like Galatia and Ephesus, they would have had apostles to help them out. Whereas the Romans before Paul showed up, they didn't. So, I mean, Paul is right to say that, like, yeah, you guys did a sick ass job keeping up the faith because, you guys didn't have an apostle to help you, but yet you guys are doing great, and so that's praiseworthy. And to be fair, I mean, Paul's not wrong. I just kind of find it funny that the amount of ego stroking that there is there, though. I think it is funny. They're like, yes, I will ego stroke you a bit because you deserve a bit of ego stroking. Hey, to be fair though, it's not like ego stroking is a bad thing in of itself. It's when people get too self-absorbed because of ego stroking. That's where you run into problems. But just like how a parent says, like, I'm proud of my kid kind of thing. Or when, a master is proud of their student. A little bit of pride is a good thing. Which, there's a different kind of pride, if you will, compared to, like, when we talk about pride being a bad thing, of being like a cocky, arrogant, dickbag. But that's a whole different thing. But here, it's a little bit of healthy pride and a little bit of healthy ego stroking, saying like, you guys doing a good job, keeping up the faith when it's not easy. And so, there's a lot of praise given there. And I just kind of find it humorous about, like, the ego stroking that Paul does here in Romans. Because I'll tell you this much, he doesn't do it for any of the other churches. Which is also kind of like a little funny bit of trivia. You don't actually really see this with the other churches. But once again, it's because the context would be that Paul is aware of the false doctrines kind of, creeping up in these other churches, and sometimes even like actually severely damaging those churches. And so Paul doesn't have time for niceties. Whereas in the book of Romans, he starts off with these niceties, and the ego stroking is a little bit funny. He'll do it more than once in the book of Romans, which is also what makes the book of Romans kind of great at times. Okay, now for the meaty stuff, because, just because we're reading the book of Romans and we're in the first week doesn't mean that we're not going to start off strong with some hot takes. Because it's one of those things that, like, and we kind of make it a meme at this point where it's like, having a hot take and how spicy is it kind of thing. But, you think of, like, when people were evolving thought in the ancient world, you have no idea everything would have been a hot take in the ancient world. Because when people were trying to evolve thought and come up with new ideas, well, everything would be a hot take. Because it's either like you try and be innovative and new, or you just stick with the status quo. That's basically it. And so, of course, as we read through the book of Acts, Christianity was just loaded with hot takes because everything about it was trying to be like new and different. For instance, the whole resurrection thing. There is real life after death. That was a crazy hot take. And so, Paul being unashamed of the gospel, as he just kind of mentioned in verse 16, I think it's funny that Paul says that because that just leads right into like, all right, we're going straight into some hot takes. And the first major hot take is this idea that, and I've said this, I've actually given the same hot take, but I give it more casually. And you may have noticed me say this in various, I've done it in the podcast quite a number of times, and in some of the Bible reading streams. But one of the things that Paul states in the book of Romans is this idea that, well, no one has an excuse to deny God's existence, if you will, the existence of the Creator, and that the big sin that we're committing now is that we're not acknowledging the Creator for being the Creator. Is basically what he's getting at. And there's some parallels when you read Acts 17 when Paul is with the Greek council and he's like talking about the unknown God, and the unknown God actually being the Creator God, and the Creator actually became a human being and rose from the dead. And that's where at that point the Greeks are like, okay, now your hot takes are too hot now. A little bit of too spicy a meatball for the Greeks. So in this take here, Paul is saying, well, God has revealed himself, even through nature. And, the way that I have worded it in the past, in case you haven't caught it, is that most people don't really have a problem with the idea of, like, the concept of God. Of, like, this outside of space-time, beyond comprehension, omnipotent being that exists somewhere in the outside the multiverse. That is not the thing most people have a problem with. Most people acknowledge that is a thing. Whether people call it God or not is not the issue. But most people acknowledge the concept of like the Creator, and that unless you're like one of those like huge major hardcore atheists, and let's be real, half of them are more like the high school atheist levels where it's just like, wow, not believing in God is the cool thing, which sounds stupid when you think about it. But anyway, most people, and of course, I account for basically every other religion in this category because, well, I mean, every religion believes this to some degree, that there is a God who created the universe and has implemented himself in that universe. And so the flaw that Paul gets at here in the book of Romans, which will understandably, because human minds are limited, and that's the contrast of like human limits versus God's infinite nature, is that we then place God in nature as opposed to saying that like, well, God transcends nature. And so that's where you get the idea of like animism, nature gods, and all that stuff. To say that, well, no, God is within nature as opposed to God being the creator of nature. But once again, the issue is not so much of denying the existence of God, because most people are like, yeah, I think a God of that nature does exist. Most people pretty much accept this to be true. Of course, the whole point of the gospel was to reveal that who God is and God's desire to relate to human beings, despite the fact we're so, well, not just insignificant would be one thing. Two, we're also pretty malicious. And that despite the fact that we're insignificant and we're malicious, that God still wants to relate to us. Which, yeah, understandably a mega hot take. Because, you think of like your modern day nihilists would just think like, well, why would anyone want to relate with anybody? Because if everything is meaningless, then why bother? And so, but Christianity obviously combats it by saying, well, no, God does want to relate with people. Because that is in Christian thinking, that is the nature of God. God is about relationship. And that's where, you get the whole Trinity thing, and that, the three persons in the nature of God. And the idea behind that is that God is ultimately relational, and infinitely so. And so this, a big part of the Trinity doctrine is that the three persons of God have always existed. And because of the three persons, God is in this infinite continual relationship in the Trinity. And so in God's nature is relationship. This is a huge contrast with other religions where, like, if God is just a singular entity, then he cannot truly relate to anyone because he will always be other. He will always be other, which is, the very praxis of, if you think of every, JRPG that exists, is that, well, since God is a singular being and he's so distant, well, then how can he relate? And then that's where you get, the hero, the hero's idea in your typical JRPG is that, well, then humans, instead of letting like a god who can't relate to people decide what humanity should do, maybe humanity should decide what humanity should do. But in Christianity, it's not like that. God is relational in nature because of that. That's the purpose of the Trinity. And so that then translates down into God wanting to relate with humans as well, to expand that relational aspect of his very being. Because of course, if people ask, well, why did God create the universe and blah blah blah, if God didn't have to, blah 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 blah. But the idea is that, like, well, God simply, as a result of this like perfect relationship within the Trinity, it naturally just grows. And so creation is just the byproduct, if you will. Now, I know that's a shitty way of wording it, but in reality, let's be real, creation is a byproduct of God's loving relationship within the Trinity. And then that must be expanded, if you will, which, once again, that's not the best word choice, but you kind of get what I'm getting at here, where that relational aspect of God has this, like, think of it this way, like, God's like, oh, I gotta have more. I gotta show this relational aspect and expand it to more than what I already have somehow. Because once again, it's weird to think that, like, well, he already has it infinitely within the Trinity. So how do you expand it and get more when you already have it in infinity? It's one of those, like, annoying ass paradoxes that would just shatter our human minds because we can't comprehend it. But that's basically what's going on. And so, like, creation was naturally spawned out of that. And it's like, sweet, humans are here, and we can do more of this. And that's basically the mind of God in a nutshell. Assuming you could put it in a nutshell. But you get the idea. And so, when Paul's talking about, like, well, God revealed himself in nature, what Paul is actually getting at is God has always been in contact with us because of this unbounding relationship desire that God has, if you will. Once again, I'm trying to put, I'm trying to put something about God into human words. So bear with me here, okay? Until the day that we are in, full presence of God, we'll never know this. But I'm gonna try my best here, okay? So you just gotta deal with it. So anyway, what Paul's getting is that, well, God has always been relating to us through nature. Which, to be fair, not that, once again, I would say that, like, well, animism, you missed the mark, but you got something on the right track here. And I will give animism I'll give credit where credit is due. And where people who follow animism are correct is that, yes, God is, in fact, in everything. If that, in some sense, of course, in most animistic religions, they tend to then divorce God from that as well in a weird, paradoxical way. But anyway, they were on the right track when they say, well, God is in everything. And there is some truth to that, because God, everything in nature exists to perpetuate God's desire for relationship. And so, in a weird way, God also has relationship with all those things as well. As weird as that sounds, like God being friends with inanimate objects, that one seems like a bit of a stretch. But then you think of, like, well, God relates to animals. Yes, he does. And then God relates to humans, obviously. So God imprints himself, if you will. But I mean, once again, I know some people will say, well, what about Genesis, where humans are created in the image of God? Well, there's that added layer of dimension with humans. But as far as God relating to stuff, God relates to everything, because that is the nature of who God is. Everything about God is his relational. Everything is about relationship with God, and so he relates to everything. And so the animal one, you can't really think that God relating with animals is a stretch. Okay, God relates with humans. If like that's already a stretch. Is it that much more of a stretch to say that God relates with animals as well? Not really. But he does, and that's kind of what Paul is. That's what Paul's really getting at when you read in this first part of like verse 18, like the middle of chapter 1, and saying that, like, well, God has in fact revealed himself through nature, and so there is no excuse, because just like how, and this is where the animists are also correct, we have a particular relationship with nature. Of course, where you kind of go off the rails is the whole, like, worshipping the Earth Mother kind of thing, but you get the idea. They were correct to say that, like, yes, you have this kind of familial relationship with Earth itself, as if Earth were a person. Which is interesting, because later in other, not in the book of Romans, but in other letters, I think I want to say Philippians is the one that does it, but Philippians is the one that uses, like, the whole Earth, and then, like, relate using human metaphors about, like, the birth pangs, and, like, Earth groaning of the birth pains. And so, like, there's this huge personification with Earth itself, as if Earth was an actual person. Then the Mother Nature idea that, yes, Mother Nature is a person. And so, but of course, what Paul's getting at here in the book of Romans is that, well, that is how God relates with all people. God relates with people through all aspects of life. But of course, as we read it as modern readers, you don't have to just do the whole animism thing. But, in all aspects of your daily living, whether, you're at work, you go to school, you're sitting in front of your computer watching YouTube, God is finding a way to relate to you through all that. And then, of course, you're extrovert that talks about, like, oh, I gotta go hiking and I feel closer to God and stuff like that when I go hiking. Stuff, you ever met those people? I met a lot of people like that. But, those people, the idea is that God is relating to us in every aspect of our life, no matter what it is. And of course, naturally, God relates to you as well through other human beings. And so that is what Paul is actually getting at when he talks about God is revealed from, God is revealed to all people. And there's no excuse. But of course, Paul immediately, takes the other side of this argument and says, well, since this is true, the whole God relates to everybody through, well, everything, there is no excuse to reject God and to say, like, oh, like, I don't have a relationship with God, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, don't be ridiculous. Like, God has put in all this, like, clearly God has put in way too much effort to relate to us, is kind of what Paul's getting at. And let's be real, he's not wrong. But, like, yes, God clearly puts in all this effort to relate to us. And so, when Paul talks about, like, why would God be so mad if we decide not to relate to him? I mean, it sounds kind of like a stupid question, especially when you say it out loud. But think of it from a very human perspective. Imagine if, and this is, this is such a god-awful illustration, but I'm going to use it. The big reason why a lot of divorces happen, they say that, like, what? More or less 50%. It's actually a little bit more than that. I think it's like 53, 54% of marriages in North America. Well, not even North America. Let's say, like, U.S. and Canada. roughly like between 50 and 55% of marriages end in divorce. Well, why is that? Well, unfortunately, a lot of the time, it happens because clearly one person wanted something a lot more out of it than the other party did. And then eventually that ends up creating strains. And then the person who puts out too much, if you will, gets tired and says, okay, I've given you all I have, but clearly this isn't working, so F it, I'm leaving. That's usually what happens. Not always the case, obviously, but that is more often not the case. And so, imagine, how someone comes to that conclusion. They go in the relationship and they're like, okay, I want this, this, and this, and that. And, we're going to do all these cool things. And our relationship is going to hit all these landmarks in the world. All these benchmarks, I meant, not landmarks, benchmarks. And, our relationship will do this, this, and that. And it's going to be awesome. And then that person puts all the effort into what they want out of the relationship. But then the other person's just like, yeah, whatever. Eventually they get to the point where it's like, I'm not like you. Don't try and push me into that. I'm not into that. Blah, 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 blah. And then the other person's like, well, come on. Like, this is what we went in, when we started this relationship, this is what we went in with. So, we agreed to this. We're going to do this. But the other person's like, I don't do this. Eventually the other person, after they're like, no, we're going to do this, and they put in effort, they spend the money, they do whatever they can, and then eventually it's like, I get tired of it. And of course when humans get to their tired point, like, it really hits them. See, the thing about God is that God is one. He's infinite, so he doesn't get tired in the same way as we do. And then because he doesn't get tired like we do, his patience tolerance is insanely high. Because, the typical human being, the patient tolerance is pretty low. And understandably so. When you only got so many years in this life, your patience tolerance is not going to be high. You just got to deal with that. That's being human. But eventually, that patience tolerance is reached, and then the person's just like, you know what? I'm tired of this. I'm tired of giving you all my love. If you don't feel the same way, then F it, I'm out of here. And that's usually how most divorces happen. And that's kind of the unfortunate nature of it. But that is the reality of how humans are. On the one hand, like, humans are meant to be social, which is true. But at the same time, humans, whether it's like out of a malevolence, I mean, it's not just malevolence, but like, hang on, sorry, I'm just reading something here. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, so eventually, you put in all this effort, and then you're like, you know what? I'm done. And then humans can quickly reach that breaking point. Although, to be fair, apparently God also has a breaking point. It's just a very high tolerance. Because that's what the book of Revelation reveals to us. That he's like, alright, I'm done with this. End of the world, guys. And so God has that moment. But it's that's a very scary thing. And that's why people read Revelation with so much like, oh, it's such a scary book. Because, like, how's the old saying go? Hell hath no wrath, like a woman scorned. I mean, hell, heaven, and the multiverse, have no wrath, like the Lord's scorn. So, that's why, the idea of, like, the day of the Lord with fear and trembling. Yeah, I can see why. And the book of Romans here kind of hints at, like, that on a very human level. Like, come on, like, God has given us so much love, so much grace, and all that. And not just to Christians, but to all people. God has been incredibly patient with every single one of us. How dare we spit in the face of that? Like, we call people who do that to other human beings, like, massive dick bags. So imagine doing that to God. Like, once again, if you did that with another human being, a person who had loved you, cared for you your whole life, and then you just spat in their face and be like, you didn't do a damn thing for me. And how hurtful that would be. You know, it's one of those things that, like, us, it's one of those things that unfortunately, like, really poisoned in our modern culture. Because, you know, oh no, Stream Parson almost entering that political sphere now. What else is new? I mean, Book of Romans already started off strong, so we're just gonna keep going in, aren't we? But you think of one of the biggest poisons in our modern culture is we've developed a culture of ungratefulness. And unfortunately, you see a lot of, like, especially when children and teenagers, I mean, part of, like, okay, teenagers are meant to be edgy and they think they're cool and shit, even though they're not. But there's a difference between being, like, a little bit edgy because you think you're cool, but then there's another thing of, like, being ungrateful. And you see a lot of, like, young people that, like, hate the older generation. And, you know, there's all the memes about, like, Zers and arguing against boomers and all that stuff. But in actuality, unfortunately, there's this kind of development of resent towards the older generation, especially from young people. And how damaging that is to our society. And so, you know, we've already, like, we are seeing this on a larger scale. Because, you know, when you kind of treat it like a TV drama or whatever, where, like, a kid acts out. I mean, it's different from, like, I mean, even a teenager acting out is one thing. It's another thing when you have an entire generation just being extremely resentful and being ungrateful for all the things that were given by the older generations. Not just the boomers, but, you know, there's a whole meme with, like, boomers versus Zers. But of course, like, the millennials also have to deal with this with the older generation as well, and this kind of resentment that has been pushed. And, you know, we're told, like, oh, the past is so racist, the past is so classist, the past is so this and that. And so it tries to enforce this idea of, like, you must hate the older generation because of all the wrong things they did. And then, ironically, the young people start doing all these wrong things and justifying evil, just so we're not what the old generation is, so we're not that bad. It's like, no, you can't think like that. You know, evil is evil, no matter who's doing it to whom. And so, and then, of course, unfortunately, this creates a cycle, because then eventually, you know, our generation will do pretty awful things, and then our children's generation will see us and be like, man, you guys were this and that, and so awful in all these different ways. And then, you know, that is what destroys a society, is that you continuously raise up generations that have this resentment. And of course, you know, it's so easy to see it from, like, the younger people's perspective about, like, oh, how much pain we've been through, blah blah blah. But when you show that resentment toward the older generation, you got to imagine the amount of pain that they go through, and that's something that I think has been lost. That people don't have that perspective. You know, I've said this so many times in, like, my podcast, but I think the biggest problem as well is that, like, a lot of younger people, they lack perspective, and so they don't think about how, like, when we do some of the things that we do, how it hurts others, especially the older generation, and how much we hurt them. And so imagine like how much it would hurt, you know, your own parents, assuming that your parents are at least half decent. You know, I'm not talking about, like, the bad parents who actually abuse their kids and use their kids for nefarious purposes. I'm not talking about those kind of parents, but, you know, your typical working class, you know, parent. They tried to give you opportunities or whatever, and then you just, like, berate them for being old fashioned, or you are disobedient to their wishes or whatever, within reason, of course. You know, not all parents' wishes are reasonable, but, um, you know, within reason. but then you outright reject them, and you don't even entertain their thoughts. You refuse to um, talk to your family or whatever just because they have different political views or something, and how much that would hurt them. And this is something that, like, fortunately in my family we haven't had to deal with this too much, because my parents, I like to believe my parents did a pretty good job with my siblings and I, and we all have a pretty good relationship with our parents, despite the fact we all have very different views on things. Like, I view things very differently from my parents, but at the same time, there's though I try to never have that, like, never have thoughts of resent. And so that's something that, how do I put this? What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to paint this idea in your heads of, like, how much it would hurt to have something that you've invested your love and your time and your life resources to, and then to have those people just be like, up yours kind of thing, and totally spit in the face of everything you've done for them, and how much that would hurt. And that's something that, like, that's every parent's fear. I'll tell you that I should have opened with this. That's every parent's fear, is the day, if the day ever comes that their children would be ungrateful and resent them, despite how much love they've given to their children. And so this is one of those interesting things when you read an older Bible story, when Jesus talks about the prodigal son. And that story has a very clear example of, like, a very resentful young man, where he's like, I want my share of the inheritance while you're still alive, which is the biggest dick move you could possibly, like, pull on your own dad. Because you're basically telling him, like, I wish you were dead, get out of my life. That's basically what he's telling him. And how much that would have hurt the father in that story. But of course, God is using, or Jesus is using, this idea that, like, God is so loving that, like, he lets us do that in our life. And then, of course, the real purpose of that story, well, there's two purposes. One of the real purposes of that story was that to show how loving God is, that even when we have done that to him, have we've offended God in such a grievous way, that God will give us many chances to come back to him. And that was that's the very first, obvious point of the prodigal son story. Then, of course, the second point is the whole thing about, like, how all human beings, we are meant, God desires that relational part of, of our worship. That real worship of God comes through how we love one another. And that's played out when the father talks to his older son. But anyway, we'll go watch the Luke videos and go back to that if you want more on that one. But basically, I know I've run this weird long-ass tangent, but what I'm trying to paint here is, I really want you guys to have this, to develop the perspective, and using this, parental illustration of how God must feel when we continue to reject him, despite the fact that God, through all kinds of means, through nature, through your day-to-day experiences with other people, with your work, school life, or whatever, your YouTube life, watching streams, God is trying to relate to you somehow. That is the nature of God, that he is very relational like that. And so, after God putting on all this effort, and then, of course, when you read through the New Testament, you have to add the resurrection on top of that, which is, the ultimate act of love is taking our sin upon himself and becoming a curse for us, as Paul will later explain this, that Christ became curse for us, which sounds like a really ridiculous idea. But the idea is, that's how far God would be willing to go for us in his love. It's one of those things that, like, in modern day culture, and because, like, Christianity's been around for as long as it has now, people kind of just treat it like it's a throwaway now. People don't really think how deeply the gospel message is when we talk about like, well, when Jesus dies for us. And some people have lost the weight of that, if you will. But of course, the Bible uses a different metaphor and talk about like how like Jesus became a curse for us. And of course, the actual word for it is anathema, and the best translation of anathema would be like God damn. So, Jesus became God damned for our sake. Like that, like if that's not the ultimate act of love, like who knows what love is at that point? Like no one would know what love is. If the idea of just giving up everything and being set to the lowest of the low into damnation for our sake, like that would be the ultimate act of love. And this is where the Catholic tradition, they have this whole statement about how like in Jesus entered hell during those 3 days, those 3 nights, if you will, before his resurrection. The idea is that like that's how deep God's love is for us, and Jesus went into hell for us, and all that stuff. That was kind of the Catholic catechism, and the idea that the Catholics were getting at was to really point out how much God loves us, and how appropriate that it would show up in the Book of Romans, because Vatican and Rome and all that. But the idea is that God has loved us so much, and so how much of an insult it is to spit in the face of that. And I think that's the better way to actually read Romans 1, because I know a lot of people, especially skeptics, like to be smartasses about this passage, where they talk about like, well, what if I don't know that God revealed himself in nature? Because I don't like see the face of God in a tree, or I don't see the face of God, in the water. And skeptics use like, illustrations like that to say like, well, what if a person doesn't know like about God in like a very formal sense when I look at like a tree or something? That's not what Paul is getting at when he says this. What Paul is actually getting at is the relational aspect that we have in everything in the world. And nature, and this is where once again I give credit where credit is due. Animism is correct in this, that God reaches out even in nature and has manifestations within them. Because the biblical idea is God is using whatever means to relate to us. That's how much God loves us. He goes through every avenue to love us. I mean, think of it this way. For those of you who've been watching the streaming Parson long enough, you guys know I sometimes use the weirdest analogies when I try to explain biblical doctrine to you. Hell, I've even used anime and like the raunchy anime to explain gospel points to you. Yeah, it sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, because it is. But the underlying idea, once again, God can even use ridiculous things like raunchy anime to reach out to you, because that's how much God loves you. He will, and this is where, the Bible uses these lines, and some people use them as throwaway statements of like, God can use evil for good. God is there, in the midst of the darkness, where there is no darkness to you, God, for you, God, because wherever you go, there is light. Whenever, you read the book of Psalms, Genesis was where I referenced God uses, God can use evil for good and stuff like that. The idea is that God will use any avenue to reach you, because that's how much God loves you. And so to reject that after God has done so much, how much of an insult that is to God. And then, of course, the other thing, too, that I think many people lose sight of this, and I've said this many a times in the chapter as well, where I made this whole, kind of hot take about how, well, in actuality, it's more like humans are more like God because God programmed us this way, if you will. But when you think of, like, Christians saying, Jesus is a personal God, what people should actually mean when they say that is that, like a person, like Jesus is a person, And so, sure, he's God, so he's not human in like a material sense, but he's a person in that he has personality, and any personality is something that you relate to. And when you relate to something, you build some kind of relationship with it. And when you build a relationship with something or someone, you're also held accountable to some degree and in different degrees, depending on the person and the relationship you have. Blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. The idea is that essentially we are accountable because we all have relationships with, well, every, whoever you come in contact with. And so, with that being said, since we have a relationship with God, well, nothing sucks more, if you will, than when love is all one way. And let's be real, my fellow otakus in the room, we've all cheered for and cried for those girls that have the one-way love relationship in the story. And the reason why we cry for those characters is because, like, it is painful. It is painful to have love be so one way like that. But at the same time, that is how God feels with us a long time. Because, we give ourselves to sin and we become slaves of sin. And, as we read through the book of Romans, Paul will come back to this point many a time, so I'm not going to go too deep into it right now. Because, don't worry, we'll get lots of chances later. But basically, we as human beings in our weakness, as well as our malice, will always go back to, like, the sinful nature. It's that whole thing with, like, how Harley Quinn always goes back to the Joker. Yeah, we're that bad. Like, I guess that's why people say Harley Quinn is so relatable. Yeah, because, we're like that with sin. We're like that with sin. Like Harley Quinn always goes back to the Joker, no matter how abusive he is. But that is kind of how fallen we are, and how much that must grieve God, and how much it hurts him. And of course, Paul here in the book of Romans, he uses illustrations, and I know there's some hot takes in here, so I'm not going to repeat them, because I know somebody's going to be like, oh, see, this insert awful negative label. But let's be real, this, when the Bible talks about, like, human beings trading good, healthy relationships for depravity, when Paul talks about these illustrations here about some cases of people participating in, like, same-sex debauchery, what Paul is actually getting at is not so much the idea of, like, well, it's the fact that, like, oh, it's a same-sex relationship. That's the least of your worries. It's the fact that people become so depraved in it. Here's the awful, awful joke. But hey, I think we've given it enough time. I think it's been long enough that this phenomenon's happened. But, like, monkeypox, and the whole scare of that, which is ridiculous, because it's like, here's what you do. Here are the steps you need to avoid monkeypox. Step 1, don't be a hoe. What's step 2? There's no step 2. But anyway. But, think of things like monkeypox or whatever as, like, our illustration here. It's like, the degeneracy is what leads to destruction. As opposed to, like, okay, if people just, were sensible, did not abuse relationships. I mean, think of, like, okay, so using monkeypox as our illustration is like, okay, how did monkeypox end up being a thing? It's like, okay, people doing, like, huge ass gay orgies, and then, like, those guys would then have sex with other people after their, like, ridiculous, same-sex orgies, and then they go have sex with other people, and then they just spread, whatever they contracted there, and then that's what caused monkeypox. But, you wouldn't have this problem if people weren't being such degenerates. Because, the whole, when you look among, like, the gay community, you don't see, like, monogamous gay men have this problem. You don't see monogamous lesbian women have this problem. It's only the people who are, like, awful degenerates having ridiculous orgies, having monkeypox. So it's like, maybe if you weren't, being degenerates, you wouldn't have this problem. And so when Paul talks about these kind of things in the book of Romans, he actually does reference that degenerate nature of, like, people just doing all kinds of wild things. And of course, it's not just sexual, but we'll use that as the example because Paul uses one as an example. But, like, for example, he uses gossip as one of the criteria as well. And I mean, yeah, you can easily apply that to, like, our internet age. That's how cancel culture functions. It's like shitty gossip blows up on the internet, and then that shitty gossip then is used to target someone and then ruin them, like, their online personality, and then you use that to ruin their careers, their lives, their relationships, and so on. Because the people who do cancel culture, they're just angry people who just want to take out anger on other people. And so once again, there's a lack of relationship. So you look at both of these illustrations I use, whether it's cancel culture or monkeypox. It's not so much of, it's, yes, there's this whole, like, root of, like, okay, sexual degeneracy, and then verbal slander. But those things come, the deeper problem, which ultimately is what we constitute as sin, but it's the sin of, let's say, it's the sin of destruction of the relationship. Just that's not the best way of wording it. But you get the idea. It's like the destruction of personal connection with others. And, then you also see, like, the people who do like, for example, cancel culture, people who slander others, you quickly find out that these people have, like, no empathy for other people. I remember I was in this funny meeting, I use that loosely, and I was hanging out with some of my buddies on my, on another stream, and we were talking about, like, how some animators had some sketchy, starts in their career. And so, for example, a lot of Japanese artists, they started, a lot of them start their careers with, like, hentai. And then I even stated, I'm like, obviously I'm anti-hentai, but I would still be empathetic toward the artists who had to do that in order to get started on the job. Because I understand, and especially when, you guys have known me long enough, and I've told you stories about, like, all the trials I've had to go through in, like, advancement and work, and how I struggled for years to find, like, stable career until, like, think of it like this, like, it wasn't until I was 32 that I actually had, like, a stable job, like, which sucks, especially in this day and age where the economy is rough. Starting an actual career job at the age of 32 sucks. And so I totally am empathetic to a struggling artist who had to draw some not so savory things to get started in their career. But then you see these other people just slander, like, oh, this guy used to draw hentai. How can he be drawing these things now? It's like, people do what they have to do. And yeah, a lot of people had to do things that were unsavory. Life is rough like that. But the bigger crime would be to be unempathetic toward people that had to do, rough things. For example, I understand the idea of, like, okay, decriminalizing the women in prostitution because, hey, most of them didn't ask for that lifestyle. And that lifestyle sucks, and a lot of them are trapped in it. And, the passionate person in me is like, I want to have empathy for those people. So I am for, the decriminalization of, say, prostitution. Of course, the real criminalization needs to be against the men who buy, men and women who buy, more often men. But you get the idea. It's the buyers who exploit people that must be punished, not the victims. And so the empathetic person in me would be like, yeah, I understand that people have like a rough, like it is rough in life, and people have to do unsavory things to get by. And so, using like the animators who had to start out their careers in hentai, it's like, yes, I understand, I'm empathetic. But then in the same conversation, some of the people I was with, they were very um, unempathetic. They'd be like, oh, you know what, like, I don't know if I can like this artist because they drew hentai. I was like, well, what? Who cares about what they were doing if that was how they had to get started in the industry? It's what are they doing now, and more importantly, how can you be so heartless to people that like in a very competitive and struggling career? You shouldn't be so heartless. And so when you think about what Paul is getting at here in this berating part, and I know I skipped over the wording that Paul he uses, because I know some people might get really mad about like, oh, this thing anti-lesbian or whatever, but the more important thing that the book of Romans is in fact getting at, and once again, the context is the earlier part of Romans chapter 1, where one of the things that Paul really tries to push in Romans 1 is this idea that the big problem that we have in this world is that we we are ungrateful to God, and thus is why we push away from his desire to relate to us. And so going back to the where this all started, and the whole point I made about how it is not the idea of like the existence of God is the problem for most people. It's the idea of that we must relate to God that is a problem for a lot of people. But in there lies the real problem, is that, well, how dare you? How dare you try and reject having a relationship with God? How dare you say that, well, actually, I don't want to be held accountable to God. I want to decide what I do for myself. I want to be the only arbiter of my own life. I don't want to be held accountable to God. And how much of an insult that is. Because imagine if you said that to like your wife or something. Like imagine you said to your wife like, I don't want to be held accountable to you, and so I want to do whatever I want. Yeah, good luck with that one. That's also a leading cause of divorces, by the way. Eventually, some people think like that, and then they find out that marriages don't work like that. And so, because of this, that is what leads into, if let's put it this way, the Bible's internal logic here is, if you're willing to be like, you know what, after everything you've done, God, after all the love you've given me, after all that, I'm still gonna be like, nah, I don't want to have a relationship with you, and I don't think a relationship with you is important. No, despite the fact of everything you've done for me, I don't think a relationship with you is important. So I'm gonna go do whatever I want, and then that quickly leads to, well, I'm gonna treat everybody like that. And so I don't want to. If I'm not gonna have a relationship with God, I'm not gonna have a relationship with anybody. And then that creates sociopathic relation. A sociopathic personality. You know, Harley Quinn and the Joker, kind of thing. Except now you're the Joker, and so that would naturally lead to all kinds of destruction. And of course, God's gonna eventually get tired of that, because it's one thing to be like, okay, you know, Christians, we always say that like, well, God is loving enough that He'll let us choose our own life. But while that's true, that also means you're gonna have to deal with the consequences. And eventually, as the transient of logic goes, and the transient of actions go as well, is that when we reject relationship and accountability to God, well, relationship and accountability with people can just go right out the window with it. Baby and bathwater gone, basically. And so we see that, yes, you know, the rejection of relationship with God is what leads to us abusing people. And eventually God's gonna be like, no, can't have that. And so there will be hell to pay for that. In a funny, twist, if you will, I remember, like, if you guys remember back in my Exodus videos, and we talked about the second commandment, where it says, you shall have no idols, you should not make yourself a carved image, and blah, 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 blah. And, one of the funny things about the Ten Commandments is that the Ten Commandments have nothing to do with what humans can do for God. And of course, the Book of Romans turns, uses the inverse logic of, because what does God need from humans? So anything God instructs us, if you will, is not so humans can please God. Even though pleasing God is the natural byproduct of following His laws, but ultimately, what God wants is for people to be good to each other. And actually, I should use stronger language. God expects us to be good to each other. He expects it. And that is also true in the book of Romans. God expects it. It's not okay, I've given you forgiveness, so you should forgive people. I've given you kindness, so you should be kind to people. No. That's not what God says. God says, I have given you forgiveness, so you must forgive others. I have given you kindness. You must be kind to others. I have given you grace. You must give grace to people. And so, this is where the accountability thing, is troubling for a lot of people that, don't want to believe, and don't want to follow Jesus, is that some people say, well, I don't want to do that. I want to do what I want to do. And if the reality is, if you just do whatever you want, then you must abuse people. That's kind of the sinful human nature. And so, but eventually God's not, he's not going to be happy with that, because it's like, no, I expect you, because I showed you love, I expect you to love. And that's where, Jesus uses that one parable about the guy who, he owed his master a huge amount of money, and then the master forgave him, and then the same guy goes to a fellow servant and goes where's my small amount of money, and then eventually the master hears about this and he gets really mad, rightfully so. That's what the book of Romans is getting at here, and Paul's kind of just painting this out in a everyday people you got to deal with in your culture kind of thing. And of course, the thing that it's not really missing context when you're reading the book of Romans, it should be obvious, is that there's a huge contrast with the people who've become believers, and then of course the broader Roman culture. And here's the other thing too that we gotta remember when we're reading through the book of Romans. We are reading roughly what's this, 50 somewhat AD, late 50s AD, let's say late 50s AD. So we're at a point in Roman history where we're not too far away from the Romans actually falling into decline as a society, because during Jesus' time, it was the tail end of what we call the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. But eventually, Rome had internal political problems, and then that led to a lot of infighting, which then led the Romans to be ill-prepared for when outside attacks came. And then that ended the Roman Empire. And so when we're reading here in the book of Romans, since we've kind of ended the Pax Romana, we're entering into the part that leads to Rome's internal breakdown. And Paul is attributing some of it to things that, hot take of the week. Well, I've already had a few hot takes, but here's the hot take of the week. The time of the book of Romans that Paul is writing to is really not that different from the world we live in today. And people, a good example is you look at how divided America is, or how divided, not just America, but we use America as our example, how divided citizens in the US are. And this is leading to this internal breakdown. And so that's why you get all these outside once the outside tyrannical forces show up, on the U.S.'s doorstep, I mean, they are showing up. The U.S. will be able to do nothing. I hate to break it to you. If and the reality is that that's what happens when you allow debauchery to take the reins of your society. And Paul is pointing that out in Romans 1. This is kind of what's happening with the people with the Romans. There's all this debauchery going on. And of course, I know many people will be quick to lock down on like the sexual stuff going on here. But it's not even just that. But like the slander, the gossip, the infidelity. What else? Greed, envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, blah, blah, blah. The list goes on. This depravity is what's going to cause the breakdown. And this is what happens when you reject a relationship with God, which is the exact thing that God warned the Israelites about when he gave the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not have idols. Do not make yourself carved images. Even though the commandment sounds like, it's about worshiping God, it's really about how people should treat each other. Because when we worship anything other than God, then we throw good relationship, starting with God and then with other people, out the window. And then, well, what do you have? What happens when you don't have good relationships? All you have is a bunch of people trying to play power politics over one another and subjugate one another. And then, of course, from that, you get abuse, you get pain, you get death, destruction, and all those things. I think that actually sums up pretty well without me going into specific details, because I already know. And this is one of those things that I had to really, when I was prepping the book of Romans, I'm like, shit, how am I going to get past chapter 1? Because I know there's going to be some spicy meatball in this chapter alone. But, it's one of those fun things about the book of Romans, that the book of Romans is one of those, it's supposed to be the basics of Christian doctrine, but, even the basics of Christian doctrine is a full-ass meal. It's one of those funny things when you read in Ephesians, and Paul talks about, the believers. It's well, in the past, I gave you milk. Now I'm going to give you meat. The book of Romans is yeah, you get a full meal with this one letter I'm writing to you. So, you better like the spicy meatball that's with the spaghetti. And so, obviously, using that illustration multiple times, you can tell I'm pretty hungry now. So, with that said, I think this is a good way of doing an introduction to the book of Romans. Once again, we will actually cover some of these themes again as we go through the book of Romans. So if you have questions, we can always come back to them. Of course, the Discord, my personal Discord is in the description, so you can always ask me questions. But I think this is a good place to stop. Also, because it's already been 2 hours. This is Romans chapter 1. I can't believe it already took 2 hours. But, I mean, to be fair, we had to do a whole ass introduction to it, so it should have only been an hour and a half. But anyway, just do some housekeeping. So, next week, and for the foreseeable future, it's going to be Monday, Wednesday, the Xenoblade Chronicles 2 streams from 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock, or 5:30, 6 o'clock. I know I've been playing longer those streams because Xenoblade is such a long game, so I know I need more time for those. So Monday and Wednesday, 2 o'clock Pacific time, we will be doing Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Next Friday at 3 o'clock. I know today I said it was going to be 3 o'clock, but I started late because I had to run an errand. So I'm sorry about that. I had to start late. I'll try not to do that in the future. But of course, once again, I'm also looking to do new things in life. So I'll keep you posted on those things. But as the foreseeable future, and at the very least for next week for sure, how the schedule is going to be on this channel is Monday and Wednesday, 2 o'clock Pacific time, Xenoblade Chronicles 3. And then on next Friday, we will continue our Book of Romans with Chapter 2 at 3 o'clock Pacific time. I know the time is weird, and I don't know why I do things this way, but I'm I'm weird like that. You guys already know that. So next week, 3 o'clock, Book of Romans chapter 2. With that said, this is going to be the end of the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed the first chapter of Romans. And I will see you guys next week. Well, I'll see you guys Monday for Xenoblade Chronicles. So until then, I hope you guys have a great Friday night. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. So, goodbye everyone, and God bless.